Rolling. I think this ship is ready to depart.
All right.
Let's do it. It's time. Oh, yeah. Yes! Oh, my goodness gracious. We're back with the Podcast Engineering Show. My name is Chris Curran. I produce podcasts for the likes of E+, Dun & Bradstreet, Forbes, and select business authors. Every week on this show, we talk about podcast production, the audio engineering aspects of podcast production. We go really deep into a lot of fundamental knowledge. We talk shop. We have great guests, podcast producers, engineers, and other specialists, and even legendary figures in the industry, which is the person we have today. That's what he is. So when I entered podcasting about 5.5 years ago, I realized that most people in podcasting don't know very much about audio, and it really cripples the sound of their audio. So that's why this show can help. So I'm happy for all you people who listen every week, and we talk about all these deeper aspects of podcast production, and you can learn and you can listen to all our previous episodes. Just go to podcastengineeringschool.com. You'll find everything. Barry, of course, is here with me.
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's right. Barry, are you psyched for this session?
Yeah, oh yeah.
All right. Sometimes it's hard to think of questions to ask Barry, but people love Barry. When I was in podcast movement, people were coming up to me all the time, go, yeah, oh yeah. And just, I don't know what it is. People love Barry. And I actually, this show has been accepted as a nominee for the podcast awards, one of the podcast awards. I think there are several, but this show is a nominee for a podcast award, which I'm so grateful to even be nominated alongside Daniel J. Lewis and Dave Jackson. And I mean, enough said. Are you kidding me? How am I in the same group with them? But anyway, I guess my show's definitely different than theirs. But anyway, I have to make my acceptance speech. You know how you have to record the acceptance speech video in advance, and I have to put Barry in the acceptance speech. No, how can I leave him out? So I got to figure out a way to sneak him in. Anyway, so today I am honored to have Doug Kaye connected with me through the internet, through Zencastr. Hi, Josh. Doug Kaye, you probably already know who he is. I probably don't even need to explain it, but he is a recovering veteran podcaster. Let's put it that way. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Dude, I think you might have the closest approximation so far. Great job.
I should have rehearsed more. But Chris, I'm gonna give up coffee because all I need to do is listen to your intros in the morning and I'll be wide awake.
Dude.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I'm telling you, this show has some energy to it. I know every show isn't like this, but nowadays you are a full-time amateur photographer, but you have been an audio engineer. You used to teach motion picture for sound. Sound for motion picture. And you also helped build the Levelator program. Or were you the guy who built it?
I was the guy who planned it. I didn't write the code. We had two people who know much more about code for that type of thing than I do, but it was my concept.
Nice. And our good friend Rob Greenlee, hi Rob, he was kind enough to introduce you to me, and I'm glad you are hanging with me on the show because I really want to talk history. There's so much you've been through and so much deep, rich history that as a person who is involved in audio engineering and podcast production, I love staying on top of all the new toys and all the new gear and all the new software, but I really, really respect the experience of someone like you. And I think even in this time with you, I'm really looking forward to hear about a lot of things. But Doug, we got to start with the speed round. I think that's a given. That's right, speed round. All right.
I'm ready.
So just tell us, within 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And I know it'll be easy for you because nowadays you have a pretty stripped down signal chain there. So tell us, your mic and where the signal goes and how you record. Just give us the overview real quick.
Couldn't be much simpler. I've got I've got a Heil PR40 like a whole bunch of other people do. It goes directly into a Steinberg CI2 little preamp thingy, and it goes USB into the Mac, and that's it. There is nothing else in the chain other than a little windscreen on the mic.
Right, and it's so interesting because when we were getting connected to do the show, you were telling me that your Steinberg CI2, well, it's an audio interface, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So there's no knobs on it? There's no controls?
Well, it's got knobs. Let's see. It's got mic inputs, which are up 100%.
Okay.
And it's got, headphone and master out, and it's got some other things. I have no idea what they do.
Nice. All right. Well, yeah.
How's that, huh?
So you're cranked up all the way. You got it cranked up to 11, actually.
That's right. All the way.
Why hasn't anyone made a podcasting audio interface that literally where the knob goes up to 11? Why hasn't that been done yet?
I should do that. Oh, wait a minute. It doesn't have any numbers at all. I should just put an 11 on it, and it'd be the only number would be 11.
Yeah. Use a Sharpie. Just draw an 11 on there
That's
and take
right.
a picture.
That's right.
All right. So you used to have, because I have proof. I have photographic proof of these two huge racks of gear you used to have. What did you used to have?
Oh, man, I had everything. I had noise gate, compressor, audio channel. I had a limiter. I had my favorite device was the Aphex Compeller. I also had ISDN gear because I used to do broadcasts to NPR stations and people like This Week in Tech. And, because Leo has ISDN capability there for his radio show. I had video recorders. The two racks were full.
That's awesome. I want to ask you about a couple of them. So the Aphex Compeller, what was that?
Yeah. That's one of the most interesting devices out there. The Compeller is, well, this is worthy of a fairly long discussion. You want to start that now?
I do. Let's do it.
All right. So think about a compressor. This is maybe the most important thing we're going to talk about today. A lot of people have compressors in their chain, right?
Right.
And what does a compressor do? It reacts with a bit of a lag because it can't predict what you're going to do or say. And when you have a loud sound, it brings the gain down. And then after some period of time, it brings the gain back up. And we all know the sound of a compressor if it's adjusted incorrectly, which is that slow sort of rush of sound coming back up after it's hit. You also have that attack if you have a very loud punch, a loud laugh or a clap or something like that. Suddenly the gain drops way down and you hear it because the background noise goes up and down at the same time, right? So that's a dead giveaway. But suppose you were doing this manually. Suppose you were writing gain on a mixing console and there were people there where they were talking. If they talk louder, what would you do? You'd very quickly pull the pot down, right? And if they talked quieter, you'd pull the pot up, right? Of course, you'd always be lagging. That's one of the problems. But here's the key, that if someone spoke very loudly and they stopped speaking loudly, you wouldn't bring the gain up. And if they were talking quietly, if there was no change in the audio, if someone stops talking, you wouldn't make a change. But yet a compressor does. When a compressor has a lot of compression in and the audio source stops, it brings the gain up. This is not what somebody would want. So what a compeller does, it says, it's a little smarter than this. It says, okay, loud sound, bring down the gain. Loud sound stops. Leave the gain alone. Now, quiet sound, bring the gain up. Quiet sound stops. Leave the gain alone. So it's adjusting, but it's not it's not trying to compensate when there's no sound. That's what a compeller does.
That is interesting. And they make a hardware version of it. I'm looking at it right now. And so there must be that delay you were talking about. There must be some small delay in the hardware, right?
Yeah, you can control it. But the fact is that when the audio source stops, it stops making adjustments. That's the key, which is what you would do if you were a perfect console operator.
Right. Like if you were like a master at riding a fader, then that's how it would be. Yeah, I really
you
like
don't
that.
ju- You don't just bring up the background noise when there's no sound. That's the key. And so you get a much better quality this way than you get out of what we normally think of as a compressor.
And now because coming from the music industry, I have never used a compeller. Is this something that came from broadcast?
Yeah, it's primarily broadcast.
Okay.
And it's designed unlike if you go back into the music industry, and you look at compressors. Compressors were primarily developed for the mastering part of audio recording, where you needed to get a certain dynamic range reduced. Right? You had a certain dynamic range, but in order to put it on vinyl or cassette or whatever, you had to bring that dynamic range down. So you needed a compressor to compress the dynamic range. It started to be used more as a way for lazy lazy people, that is, right?
Right.
People who couldn't properly ride the gain, or maybe they were working in an unattended environment. They didn't have a sound operator. And so they needed a way to have like automatic gain control, which is what we have like on a lot of our portable recorders, right? We have AGC. And that's what compression became. It became a shortcut for having proper levels. But of course, you can get some pretty... I was listening to one of the Lady Gaga albums that came out. She got 2 albums out with incredibly heavy compression. And this has become very trendy in a lot of popular music right now. To have compression, it's so hard that, you've got the kick drum and it just bangs the level down and then the level rushes back up after the kick drum kick, right? And it's incredibly, you get very loud, effective volumes, but it's sort of an obnoxious sound to my ear, at least.
Yeah, and I think actually nowadays, I think music producers and engineers are using that over compression as an effect. So, like you said, when the big kick drum thumps, the whole mix gets like sucked in a little.
That's right.
That they are almost using that as an effect in a way. Right.
And we see, we hear it in TV commercials where they're trying to, they don't want to exceed the peak level because they can't do that, but they want to make sure that the average level is very high. And of course, then there were FCC regulations that came out saying, you can't do that. You've got to have all these specifications for what your actual levels are, but they're very complex and tricky. But compression was used to make a signal punchier. Whereas my personal taste is that that's not necessary. For example, you go into classical music recording. In good classical musical recording, you never use a compressor, except maybe at the very end when you have to master this thing for a somewhat more limited dynamic range.
Right. And of course, the ultimate example of over compression and limiting is radio itself. So
yeah. AM radio, right? Well, you look at those expensive processors that are, designed for AM, primarily AM radio, but now FM too, that go in the rack and just really get every ounce of sound that they could get out of that track. Right.
So the compeller, is that something that's used in broadcasting? Is that, well, I think it's a dumb question. I think I realized I'm about to ask a dumb question, but it's used in the signal chain that's going out live, right? It's like the mic goes into a mic pre, then it goes to a compeller, then it goes out, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And where you typically use it is in an environment where you're going to have a wider range of levels than you'd like. Maybe you have multiple speakers with multiple mics, or you're not going to be able to attend to the levels that carefully. And it's not a huge range thing. You can't really crank it up like you can crank up some compressors, but it's going to make a big difference. It might make a difference of 12 or 15 dB, which is enough to make a difference between whether you can understand the podcast in a moving car or not.
Yeah. Oh, you nailed it right there. I just took another road trip, and again, I listened to several podcasts where I just had to turn it off because it wasn't present enough. It wasn't thick enough to cut through road noise.
The big problem that I listen to a lot of podcasts in the car, and the interview will be nice and loud, and the interviewee will be very soft. So I'm sitting there bringing the volume up and down and up and down. And it's I just give up. I say, I'm not going to listen to that podcast anymore. If you don't have consistent levels, your podcast will not be listened to over the long term.
Totally. All right. So the Compeller, I'm sure they must make a plugin for the Compeller. And so are you into plugins? Have you ever been into plugins, or was that sort of?
Yeah, we had a lot of plugins for a while. I used Audacity quite a bit. I used to use SoundForge a lot. But we had, in whatever it was, when did I start the Conversations Network? I guess it was around 2005, we started a thing called the Conversations Network. And it's a long story too, but we needed to have a software version of this. Let me explain what we were doing. We were building shows out of components. Now, when I say audio components, for example, it might be as small as the credits. So it might be somebody saying, the audio engineer for this episode is or was cut, and then a recording, Doug Kaye. We might have little pieces for our sponsors, but every little piece, an average show would be made up of maybe 20 components, let's say. The body of the show might be just one component. And we had to assemble these automatically, sometimes on the fly. Well, if you're going to assemble a single sentence from separate components, those levels have to match.
Right.
So we developed software at the Conversations Network to standardize all the levels so that if you recorded two parts of a sentence a week apart, they'd have the same level and they could be cut together as a single sentence and you wouldn't hear the difference. And after we developed that and we built our show assembly system, then we decided that because podcasting audio was not very good in those days, we decided to create the Levelator and give it away for free to the podcasting community. And that is a software version of the Compeller, if you will, but it works much better because it's processing pre-recorded audio. So it can make multiple passes through the audio in order to figure out what the level should be. It doesn't have to react. It doesn't have to say, uh-oh, the level just went up, better bring it down. It goes and creates a map, if you will, of the audio for the track, and then can go back and apply that map to smooth things out much more naturally.
Right. That's great. And so Levelator is still around, right? I know some people still use it. Yeah,
absolutely. It's what happened was we closed the Conversations Network a few years ago, and we cut a deal with the Internet Archive to not only archive every show we'd produce, which is around 5,000 shows or so, but also to host things like the Levelator. And I'm going to do something right here live on television, which is go to, I have to be able to spell it though. It's funny. Levelator.org. Yeah, if you go to levelator.org, you'll see a slightly broken page, but at levelator.org, which takes you to archive.org, you will be able to download the latest versions for Windows and OS X.
Okay. And is it still actively being updated? Because I heard someone say that it was not really being updated.
Not really, but what happened was, for example, they came out with a new version of the Mac operating system and it didn't work. So we were able to go back to the developers and cajole them into updating it, which they did.
Oh, I see.
We have not tested it with the very latest version that hasn't come out yet, but we will do so. And if an update's necessary, we'll try and do that.
Okay. And just so the audience knows that Levelator is, or I should say it the other way around, Auphonic does something similar. Well, Auphonic does a lot, but some of what Auphonic does is similar to what Levelator does. But I'm sure the innards are a little bit different. But I want to.
Well, they would have to be different because of the algorithms that we used. I have not tested Auphonic. It might be better. It might be worse. It also might be up to date with some of the latest loudness standards. We developed our own standards for loudness because they didn't really exist. We did a lot of research on this.
Right.
And we did it in conjunction with surveying many of the public radio stations here in the United States. And we developed our own standard, and then the FCC came out with their rules about broadcasting and created a whole new set of parameters. And Auphonic you may want to check with them. They may have adopted those new parameters. You'll get the same effect either way. But there's nothing as easy as a Levelator. It's free. You install it, and you just take a WAV or an AIFF file, and you literally just drop the file on the Levelator icon, and a few minutes later, you have leveled audio.
So have you been up on these latest standards? They call them the Lufs Standards, like the loudness units.
I have. I've read them when they first came out enough to understand what the issues were and compared them to our experience. It's a much more complicated issue than most people think.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, because I know, Levelator even before that with the Conversations Network with your show assembly software, you were trying to take all a bunch of different clips and level them to the same level and then piece them together. So it provided a really good listening experience. I wanted to ask you, because in my experience, a lot of the DAWs nowadays and a lot of the software, you can actually like highlight a clip and say, oh, normalize this to minus 19 Lufs. And a lot of people who produce podcasts, they will just go through each track in the DAW and say, put this one at minus 19 Lufs, make this minus 19 Lufs. But in my experience as an audio engineer, and I'm sure you'll agree that just because something might be the same loudness technically, either by Lufs units or I guess the older way of doing it is with RMS, values, right?
Yep.
So, but everything that's set to minus 19 Lufs, it perceptually, some pieces will sound a little bit louder and some will sound a little bit softer. Is that something you've experienced? Yeah,
it's not perfect. And the real challenge comes in the question of how do you measure loudness? Because let's say your basic method of measurement is RMS, root mean square. So you're going to basically measure the amount of power in the waveform. Let's not worry about frequency differences, because obviously there's a difference between low frequencies and high frequencies. But let's assume that everything's pretty normal in that sense.
Right.
The problem now is, over what period of time do you measure that? So if you measure that over the course of 1 minute, I may stop. I pause. I stop. Now, what's happening is when I pause, it's lowering the average RMS, isn't it?
Right.
Over that period of time. So what'll happen is if I do a lot of pausing, the algorithm might think that I'm speaking more quietly. If I don't pause, it's going to say, oh, the total or average RMS over this period of time is higher. Well, what's the right unit of time? Do you get it down to, 100 milliseconds? What
right.
unit of time do you measure? If you're doing tones, that's easy. But if you're doing speech, it's quite complex. So it's not foolproof. You will hear some changes no matter what algorithm they're using. But let's face it, we're talking about making things much better than they were before.
Yeah, exactly. Even if in my example, if you set everything to minus 19, they're going to be close. I mean, they're not going to be far off. They might,
right.
I'd say maybe perceptually 2 dB away would be a lot. So
yeah, and it depends. It depends what you're listening. If you're listening through inexpensive earphones, if you're listening through something with a big subwoofer and a good studio, you're going to hear what might sound even in one environment won't sound even in another.
Yeah, and that's because of the frequencies. So that's
right.
sort of why I was asking, is because if you have a voice, for instance, let's say it's a voice, a podcast host and a guest. Let's say the host voice is really bassy and full, and the guest voice is very mid-rangey and high frequency. There's not a lot of low end. If you set them both to minus 19, I guarantee the person who's more mid-rangey and high frequencies, they're gonna sound louder, because the low frequencies in the host voice take up more power. But I was told that the loudness standards, the Lufs units, however they measure that takes that kind of thing into consideration as well. But I don't know how they do that.
Yeah, but it does. That's part of the algorithm. But how does it take into account the listening environment? It can't do that.
Right.
Go back to your automobile, where you probably don't have particularly good lows, and you have road noise. So the road noise is going to compete with primarily the lows and the midtones. So,
right.
You can't solve it for all listening environments.
Right.
You certainly can't solve it for all voices. But the question is, can you make it good enough? And we all know that we can, listen to talk radio in the car, and it works pretty well. So can we get our podcasts to be as good as what we hear on talk radio? And we certainly can now with the tools that we have.
Right. You also mentioned ISDN that you used to have. So I haven't looked much into ISDN, but can you just explain what that is? I mean, does it go over, it's a connection, is it over a normal phone line?
Yeah, ISDN was developed, Integrated Services Digital Network. What it does is it takes a regular 4-wire telephone connection and runs digital over it. Not digital over audio like with a modem like in the old days, but literally digital over that wire. And it gives you, let's see if I can remember, I think it's 2 B channels and a D channel, and each B channel is good for 64 kbits per second, so that'll give you stereo at 64, and the D channel is sort of the control channel. And this was used in the 60s, 70s, all the way, I would say, up until about 10 years ago. It was extremely common. It was installed by the phone company, and it was put in at every broadcast venue. So if you had a stadium, if you had a theater, certainly if you had a studio, everybody wired up for ISDN, and it all goes through the phone company's infrastructure. And then you can dial another ISDN device just like you have it has a phone number. And if you wanted to do a remote, let's say from a sports stadium back to the studio, you'd have an ISDN connection for the duration of that event. And you'd get what was then considered broadcast quality audio between the two locations. You'd have obviously broadcast quality going from the remote to the studio, and you'd have some lower quality coming back. If you didn't need to use the 2 channels for stereo, then you could use 1 for the reverse. It was expensive, required specialized gear. But once the internet really became available everywhere, it became cheaper and better to just put a good internet connection at every location and use, well, initially the equipment was as expensive as ISDN. Now, of course, it's much less. You can use Skype, right? And you could do a Skype remote back to your studio, and it sounds, a remote on Skype actually sounds better than what we used to get with ISDN. But ISDN was the only way, the only way that you could get broadcast quality audio to a remote location where you didn't run literally a dedicated line. Or microwave. You could go microwave, but that's much more expensive.
Microwave? What is that?
Yeah, microwave. Right. So you bring out your television. You bring out your television van, right, and you put up your antennas, and you have you beam it. Go to a satellite, or go to a ground-based microwave channel.
Oh wow! See, that's crazy broadcast stuff right there.
Yeah, and it's expensive. I mean, a microwave truck has like a crew of 5 people, right?
Right.
I don't. We did a thing like that years ago. There was a venue in Maine. And we used to do live shows from Maine, and we had the phone company come in and put in ISDN lines there. And we did literally a live stream from the Opera House in Maine. And then Yahoo got involved, and they said, oh, we want to do video, and we're going to bring in a satellite truck. And we said, okay, well, we'll step back and let you do that. You've got a lot more money than we do. And Yahoo brought in the satellite truck and all this stuff, and they never got it to work.
So that gave me an idea, Doug. What we should do, you, me, a few other podcasters, whoever, let's get like a big, like a tour bus, and we'll get the whatever microwave satellite dish thing on top that you just said. And we'll ride around the country. We'll do live podcasting from the tour bus.
No, what we do is we get the bus and we put a big ass antenna on it, and we just pretend it's working. Right? And when we have it move, it has to articulate and turn and tilt up and down and look really cool. But in fact, we'll just use a cell connection.
Have some flashing lights and stuff.
There you go. Yeah, flashing lights. Those are always good. Yeah.
Put up cop tape, whatever you call that.
Yeah. Crime scene.
Tape
Crime
off
scene,
the
yellow
area.
tape. Yeah, that's right.
I wanted you also in your old rig had an Aural Exciter, Aphex Aural Exciter, which
Yes,
I think I mentioned last session. I just bought the plugin. It's a plugin that's emulating the original Aphex Aural Exciter. So, can you just explain for the folks what an exciter does?
It's a combination of lots of pieces. It's got, I think it has a compressor in it. A compressor in it. It has, and it's also most important is a frequency dependent compressor. So you can do what they call big bottom. You could bring up just the bass.
Right.
So you could control the compression based on frequency. I think the Aural Exciter also had a noise gate. I'm trying to remember if a noise gate was part of that, which can be, an important thing if you're not in a quiet environment. And so it had a whole bunch of little things, but it was basically a preamp with a bunch of tweaks. Might have had some equalization. I haven't, the plug-in should be every bit as good as the physical device. There's no reason it couldn't be.
Right.
But it does obviously use CPU cycles. Now it's also the Aural Exciter. The hardware one was an analog device, so you can do things in limiting with an analog device that you can't do in digital. Like go back to a tube amplifier for a guitar. You can pump in more distortion. It still doesn't clip. It just distorts.
Right.
So you can do things in an Aural Exciter that you can't do with the plug-in. But today I wouldn't waste my time getting a hardware device unless I just wanted to look cool. I'd get the software.
Well, that's in our tour bus. We'll have to have like a bunch of racks of gear, but it's all like fake gear.
Yeah, and it's cheap. You can buy the stuff, and you can add blinking lights to all of it.
Right, that's what we need.
It's really cool.
So I think,
and I have to make sure I bring my oscilloscope too and put some pattern on it because that's always part of looking cool too.
That's great. So I think the way an exciter works is like for instance when you use an exciter to boost high frequencies, I think it's not like an EQ where it just boosts all the high frequencies. Doesn't it only boost like the harmonics or something?
Oh, it can. That's right. So what they do is they actually have a harmonic generator. So what they'll do is they'll create a certain amount of distortion that will generate harmonics. Harmonics, if you think about it, are a distortion. If you have a pure tone, but you start coming out with either, you come out with even or odd multiple harmonics. So let's say you have a tone at 1,000 hertz. Now you also have a tone at 3,000 hertz that's maybe, 12 dB down. So it's, of course, when you go thirds like that, it's not an octave. If it doubled, it would be an octave. If you went from 1,000 to 2,000, that would be one octave. 1,000 to 3,000 is something more than an octave, less than 2 octaves.
Right.
But if you look at distortion, it's usually in multiples of 3. And that gives you a different sound. It's changing the sound. It's making it richer, perhaps, than just that. Some people like it. Some people like the sound that they get. I'm more of a purist. I mean, I spent years and years and years just trying to record clean audio. It was painful for me to think that I might want to purposely mess it up.
Right. So you used to also have an RE20. So did you decide to move from an RE20 to this PR40, or did that just happen?
Yeah, I talked to Bob Heil when he first came out with the PR40, and he said, "Oh, it's great. It sounds much better than the RE20." And I had the RE20 with all the equalization, all that stuff, and I was happy with it, and I was used to the sound. I mean, you used to see it in every broadcast studio in the world. And we talked about kick drums. RE20 was forever, still is one of the best kick drum microphones. But Bob said, you got to give this a try. And I did. And I said, wow, that is just great sound. I get the sound out of that mic that I used to try and get out of the RE20 with a little bit of equalization. So I think I just like it. And again, the proof is that I've eliminated every piece of gear from the chain.
Right. Yeah, that's huge. Being purist and just having the signal go in the shortest distance from the mic to the recorder in the cleanest way is awesome.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that the PR40 is accurate. I wouldn't say that it's, the best microphone in terms of accuracy, but it just sounds really good for voices, male voices in particular.
Right. We did at the podcast movement in this past August, we did the microphone test drive booth, and we had 10 mics, and one of them was a PR40, and And actually, the one that surprised me the most was the Audio-Technica BP40, which is a newer mic. But anyway,
what did people think of the PR40? Did it rate highly?
It did. I mean, so on some people it sounded really good. On other people it didn't sound good. So that's why I was telling everyone, look, each mic has a character, a different character, and each person's voice is different character. So you have to match them up. Like, just because one mic works for you doesn't mean anything for me, and vice versa. So that's why you have to try them and kind of see, okay, which one really does sound greatest on my voice.
Yeah.
So.
And of course, the problem is that none of us are used to hearing our own voices without the bone conduction in our heads.
Right.
So anytime we listen to our own recordings, it sounds weird to us. So you almost need to have somebody else make the decision for you. I don't think I can accurately judge the sound of a mic of my voice. Now, I say I like it better, and I made the decision, so I'm obviously disagreeing with myself, which isn't the first time I've done it. But I do think that when it comes to picking a microphone for your voice, you need to rely on the opinions of other people, because it just sounds so weird to you.
Right. And by the way, I know Ralph M. Rivera is taking a sip of his drink right now, because every time someone mentions the phrase bone conduction on this show, Ralph drinks.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And by the way,
bone conduction.
Nice. And by the way, I just realized when you're talking about mics, we're talking about mics and voices and matching up. Does anyone know? I mean, you heard Barry's voice when we started. I mean, does anyone know? Maybe this is a trivia question. What microphone I use to record Barry?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. Just email me. Go to podcastengineeringschool.com and go to the contact us page and send me a note. What mic do you think I recorded Barry with?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, Barry, do you have your own answer to the question?
That's a mystery.
Yeah, it is. It's a mystery. It's, what was I going to, there was one before. So
how many of those clips do you have?
I have a lot.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard Ralph M. Rivera's podcast called Carbon-Based Business Units?
I have not.
Okay. If you Barry's here, of course, with me. So Barry, tell them what people are going to hear if they listen to Carbon-Based Business Units.
There's no activity, no giggle, no nothing.
That's good. I haven't heard that one before. That's good.
Yeah, that's a classic. So I want to get into this. Let's talk a little more history. I want to ask you about how much compression people should use and what that looks like. But first, let's get into any more of the history. Like, I know you were doing stuff in the 70s. Like, what can you share with us? Any interesting shifts or transitions in your audio engineering career through history? Well,
it all started with tape, right? So
nice.
Everything was on tape. I did a little bit of front of house sound in college and did, a little college radio. But when I got out of college, I worked as a sound recordist and then as a mixer and sound editor in motion picture, and everything was tape. And, which meant the big thing about tape, two things. One, of course, is that you have linear access instead of random access. And the other is that you have generational losses in quality. So every time you made a copy, it got worse.
Right.
Whereas in digital, of course, you have random access to all the sound, and you can make, as long as you're not using any compression, you can copy it as many times as you want and not lose a thing.
Right.
So that's the big change. I went from doing film sound and then doing post-production film sound, and then I took a few decades off and had a career in high-tech stuff, and then came back to it just because of podcasting. I had officially retired from the .com world, and I was writing a book. And I was writing a book on a subject that I knew nothing about, which is what most people who write books do. And that meant that I had to interview people who did know what they were talking about. So I'd call people up on the phone and I'd ask them for permission to record the interview just so I wouldn't have to take notes so arduously. And they'd say, sure. So I started listening to these recordings, and I realized that the people I was interviewing were more interesting than the book was going to be. I went ahead and published the book anyway, but I went back to a lot of these people and said, hey, can I put those recordings on the internet because I think they'll be interesting? And that started something called IT Conversations, which I began in, pretty early 2003, I think. So what is that, 14 and a half years ago? Mm-hmm. And you know the history there, which is that in September of 2003, Dave Weiner, who was the inventor of RSS, got the idea of adding an enclosure tag to RSS feeds. And in the enclosure tag, you could put the URL of an MP3 file. That created what I think we call today a podcast, which is an RSS feed with MP3 attachments. Mm. And he did that with Chris Lydon's radio show. Actually, it was an audio version of his blog, more or less. And it was pretty much the next day after Dave did that, I said, hey, I could take my audio recordings and do the same thing. So IT Conversations became literally the second only podcast ever. It was a day after Dave did it the first time.
Wow.
And so we did that for a number of years. It was me. It was my interviewing people. And it was popular. And then we had a lot of people said they wanted to contribute to it. They either wanted to contribute money, which I thought was cool, or they really wanted to contribute time. There were a lot of people out there, particularly budding audio engineers, that wanted to help edit the shows. So we created this thing called the Conversations Network, and we applied for and got a 501c3 nonprofit status here in the U.S. So it was and actually still is a legitimate nonprofit organization. And we had volunteer audio engineers. And we had, over a period of 9.5 years, we probably had 250 people working on our shows, either as audio engineers or as writers who would write the show descriptions. But this is where...
Hold on, Barry has a comment about that.
Uh-oh.
Wow, man. Wow.
Yeah, 250 engineers. Wow.
Yeah, 200, I think it's 255 or something like
Nice.
that total. Spread out over many years. But these people had a range of skills. Some were very good, some weren't. And this is, again, while we had to develop the Levelator. We didn't want people going in. Most of these things were either interviews or they were recordings from conferences. We pretty much disrupted the conference recording business that used to be out there. And we didn't want people to have to go in there and edit ums and ahs. We didn't want to have them to, like you were talking about, using the DAW to go in and adjust the levels, right? And have the faders go up, down, up, down, up, down all the time. Yeah. We wanted people to go in and chop off the head, chop off the tail, fix any major glitches in between, done, move on to the next one. Right. And that's why we had to develop the software, both for show assembly and for leveling audio. And it turned an average audio guy into a very good audio guy,
right? Because
he was able to produce audio with far less work and far less skill. So anyway, a roundabout answer. Like I say, the big change back to your question, the big change was from analog to digital audio recording. And then of course the internet, because when we started all this, we did not have a good way of doing audio over the internet. Skype was horrible and unreliable. Everything else was a disaster. It was really, really bad. And we ended up doing, you remember double enders? Do you guys ever talk about double enders on the show?
Yep.
So we started doing double enders and trying to merge those things together. And that's a pain in the ass. So, we developed a whole bunch of articles and white papers for how to use Skype the best it could be, and blah blah blah. Also, the whole problem with microphones. Gosh, if you have somebody doing a remote with you, if you only wanted telephone quality, it was easy. You just say talking to the telephone. Everybody knows how to talk into the telephone. But if you want to do good recording with a headset, people put the microphone under their nose so they're breathing into it. The microphone's too far away, so that doesn't work well. Leo Laporte and I both used to be in the business of sending out headsets. We found inexpensive headsets that we could just send to guests. Say, hey, keep it, not a problem. But this is the headset to use. And they were USB for simplicity.
Right.
But what happened was a few years ago, a number of years ago, Skype was very aggressive about improving their codecs. And the quality of Skype went way, way up to the point where a good Skype connection is, better, certainly better than the ISDN we were using. And, you're using, what is it, Fractal?
This is actually Zencastr we're using. The platform.
Zencastr, okay. They're using Zencastr and, which is fine, but Skype works remarkably well too, especially if you split the tracks, because with Skype you can record separate tracks. So
how do you do that? How do you do that on Skype? Record separate tracks?
I use Call Recorder.
Okay.
Call Recorder, it's a plug-in to Skype, and it will create. In fact, right now I'm still active in one podcast. I do a photography camera review podcast with Gordon Lang based in Brighton, England. And we record audio and video using Skype. And I get 4 tracks. I do the post-production. So we get 2 video tracks, one from his camera, one from my camera, and 2 audio tracks, one from each of our microphones. And the quality is, as long as we've got good connections, the quality is terrific.
Right? That's cool. So, yeah, Skype these days, I'm shying away from it because of the glitching and stuff. And that's why, like Zencastr, I don't know if you know about these new platforms like Zencastr, which actually connect you like Skype, but they actually do like the double ender style recording in the background. So that way you can connect with someone who knows nothing about double enders, and literally it's recording them locally on their machine and uploading it slowly in the background. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, for Gordon and for me, we have a controlled environment. It's just the two of us. It's the same setup every time. So it's safe, let's say.
Yeah.
We don't need the back. For a while we were recording at both ends and he was shipping me his tracks, but it just turned out not to be necessary. In fact, when he recorded Skype locally, the remote audio that I got was better than his local recording. And I think that's because his laptop was relatively slow.
Oh.
And to record the audio and the video was a little bit too much for his laptop.
Got it. Yeah. Hey, by the way, you were talking about guests having headsets and not using it right or messing up the sound. Nowadays, it's earbuds. People are connecting to be a guest on a show. They just plug in their earbuds, and that stupid cable with the mic on it just flaps around and rubs against their shirt. And
so it's not just the earbuds; they're using that microphone too.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awful. I mean, we had that in motion picture recording. Of course, we had to hide lavalier microphones in people's clothing, and that was always a disaster because those were really sensitive. They'd brush up against anything.
Right? Yeah, I'm trying to find a mic. I'm still trying, by the way. I've mentioned this in earlier sessions. I'm trying to find some way that I can record myself, like, without anyone knowing that I'm recording myself. So, like, I can't be wearing earbuds and be talking and recording myself. I want to be, like, when I go to meetings and stuff or meetups, and I'm talking about, let's say, meditation and spirituality. Like, sometimes I'll go on a 15-minute tangent, and it's awesome. And I'm like, and I have a podcast show about meditation and spirituality. And I'm always like, you know what? I wish I recorded that 15 minutes because that's perfect content for my show. But the problem is, in a meetup, I don't want the other people to know that I'm recording because it's a nice trusting environment. And I don't, you know how when you're recording, people can get a little, squeamish. So I want to record myself in secret, but I don't know what mic to get. I don't know where to hide it. And anyway.
You can track down some old Google Glass.
That's what
of course, then they'll say, why do you have a camera?
I need something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's talk about compression. So compression is something, I mean, we talked about it a little, but let's talk about it more in practice because there are plenty of podcasts. I would say at least 80% of podcasts don't use any compression at all. And when you record a mic without any compression, I mean, the smallest drifting off the mic or talking softly and then laughing out loud, like it's just too dynamic. And then you just can't, like you said, when you're riding down the road or you're on a treadmill or you're running, you can't handle it. So compression is like very important to sort of level out the dynamic range and make a good experience for listening. But then again, you can also overdo it, right, Doug?
Yeah, and I think it's a mistake to use compression to solve that problem, because compression is primarily for shorter term transients. It's not designed for leveling. I think for leveling, you need to use like the plugin you were talking about. Is it Alphonics? Is that the name?
Alphonic.
Yeah. You need to use a plugin like that, or the Levelator or something, because that's literally solving a different problem. That is a matter of trying to maintain a consistent level where the levels may change over a relatively long period of time. Look at what's the release time on a compressor? You set it to, half a second or 2 seconds or something like that, right? And leveling is done over a longer period, primarily over a longer period, but it also has to do that. So I think a compressor is the wrong tool for maintaining a consistent level. I think you're better off recording at levels that might be a little low. You certainly don't want to clip, because once you get clipping digital, you can't get it out. There's no going back with clipping.
Right.
So you record your stuff with a safe level, and then you use Levelator or the Phonic plugin or even the Compeller plugin to normalize the audio levels. That's a totally separate problem from compression. Compression is literally, as I said earlier, to limit the dynamic range of the audio on a relatively short-term basis.
Right. Yeah, and so when I talked about that kind of let me put it this way: if I ever have to use a compressor to help level out a track, I'll use a really long release time. Like if you set the release time to like 3 or 4 seconds, it does a similar job as a leveler, but of course it's a little bit different. But
right. And the difference is that over 3 and 4 seconds, your background noise is going to come up if you're quiet, right? And with a leveling, with a leveler, it will not, because when you stop talking in your loud voice, the levels stay low, and they don't come up until you start talking again. If you start talking in a loud voice, no change. If you start talking in a quiet voice, then it brings up the audio, but it has a threshold, and that threshold says this is the no sound threshold. This is the threshold where I don't take any action at all, and a compressor won't do that.
Right.
Well, does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It definitely makes sense, and that's why I want to actually look into this Compeller thing and see if there's a plugin that does it.
Yeah, and I think I take the situation. So let's say we're talking, and let's say we both get very loud and animated, and Barry comes in and it's noisy, and all of a sudden we go quiet. You're not going to bring up the level. You wouldn't naturally do that. That's the problem. You want a natural sound.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, look at those three. You've got Levelator, Alphonic, and Compeller. Those are 3 pieces of software that'll do it for you.
Yeah, and compressors, to me, one of the effects is that it brings the sound like more in your face. Like that's the kind of the way I
it adds punch. Let's just say it's punchier, right?
Yeah.
And it does. It definitely does that. And it's the it's the big, hey everybody, it's AM radio. Welcome to 1010 on your dial. It's that big punchy AM sound where you literally want to attract attention with the quality of the sound. And it's the difference between, NPR's sort of put you to sleep kind of sound and, AM top 40 radio sound, right?
Right.
And that's the difference. I mean, I go around the country sometimes and I turn on, the radio in cars just to see what people listen to locally. And some of those stations are still out there just pumping and pumping and pumping.
All right, Doug, let's talk about mono and stereo. I know even you mentioned before we started recording about that I mentioned some little stereo tricks on this show. So what are your feelings on mono and stereo?
And I wanted to mention something about that because I was listening to a show a few shows back, and you were talking about mono versus stereo and joint stereo in MP3, you're better recording in mono versus stereo. But I'm going to put something out there that I believe from my research, and I think other people should research it. And if they don't, they're going to have opinions anyway.
Right.
You pay no price for stereo. If you're, let's say your stream is 128 kbits per second.
Right.
You're going to get the same quality with audio and stereo. In fact, if you take a mono signal and just split it, and you have the left and right channels are identical, in joint stereo, you're primarily putting out two tracks. One is the left plus right. The other is the difference between the two. So the difference track has nothing in it if the left and the right are the same, right?
Right.
So you pay no penalty for putting your recordings out as stereo versus mono, and you don't have to double the bit rate because it's stereo just to get the same quality. All right. Now, that's people are going to write into you. They're going to call you and say, Doug is full of it, and that's just not true. But I encourage everybody to go research this thoroughly, and you will see that this is the case. And that's the advantage of joint stereo versus, whatever they called old stereo. Old stereo was literally two tracks,
right,
each one with half the bit rate of the total track. Okay. We started in mono because we were mistakenly thinking that it cost us something to go to stereo. And we started at 64 kbits per second because audio bandwidth was hard to come by and the internet was expensive and all that. But what we found, interestingly, was, at least in the early days, podcasts were listened to on MP3 players, even before the iPod. Were these little MP3 players,
right,
and they were made by Sony and various people, and there were all sorts of problems because some of them wouldn't play mono, right?
Weird.
And so we tried things like odd bit rates. Like 48K sample rates instead of 44.1 sample rates, things like that. And a whole bunch of these devices wouldn't play the tracks. And we were getting complaints from listeners saying, hey, I can't hear your stuff. So that's the main, even though we didn't have really stereo material, we had mono material, we went to super standard stereo. I think we went to 96 kbits per second and 44.1 sample rates,
right,
44.1 K sample rates. And that was really important. Nowadays, I don't know. I'm out of touch with this. It may be that there are no devices that don't play certain types of tracks, but I think it's important to release your podcast in a format that's as universally listenable as possible. I think that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And at this point, that's, pick your bit rate, but it's stereo, and it's probably 44.1.
Yeah. I mean, if there's any type of music on a podcast, it just has, especially if the music is already produced in stereo, it should be in stereo.
Yeah.
One great argument, someone, who was it? Was it Travis Hill? One of the previous sessions, he told me that, a lot of these, for instance, TuneIn Radio, it's a radio app. But now they're carrying podcasts, just like iHeartRadio. So
right.
What's going to happen is someone is going to be listening to radio in stereo. And if they switch over to your podcast and it's in mono, it's going to be like it's going to be a letdown. It's going to sound like crap because people who listen to the radio on, streaming online radio, they're used to stereo. So
yeah, if it's music, if you're talking music.
Well, but usually in the beginning of a podcast. Yeah.
And you're right. Even if it's just the lead-in music needs to be stereo. So the whole podcast should be stereo. No reason not to. And you're not paying. My point earlier was that you're not paying a penalty for stereo. You get it for free. Now, when your left and right channels are substantially different, then you actually drop your quality because you have the left plus right and the left minus right are both fully using bandwidth. So you will get a little bit of loss. But, what are you putting these things out at, 128K, something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it goes out at 128K, the worst case is you've got 64K bits per second on each channel, and that's pretty good.
Right.
And that's only if your left and right channels are completely different and not empty.
Right.
Right.
So you're saying when a joint stereo file is saved, it doesn't save it as one left channel and one right channel. It saves it as left plus right and left minus right or something?
That's right. Yeah. So you're basically recording the audio plus the differences between the two channels.
Oh, okay. But then how does it recreate the stereo sound on playback?
It just uses that difference channel to subtract to one and add from the other. It works quite. I mean, it's magic math, right?
Okay.
But the main thing is that it doesn't require the full bandwidth twice.
Right.
That's the main thing.
Right. So it's not twice mono.
Right.
In terms of file size.
Right.
Cool. Well, Doug, this has been awesome, man. I'm so happy that you were able to hang with me and Barry, of course.
Of course.
Hey,
of course, Barry.
Hey, Barry. Barry, he just told me he was in Florida during the Hurricane Irma that just came. No, I just set it up wrong. Oh my God. It's so hard to ask Barry questions. This is a new one. This is my first time using this one.
Okay.
Hey, Barry, did you, you heard from Chris Kremitzos in Florida and how they got through Hurricane Irma, right? What did they have to do?
They just had to hunker down.
Oh, that wasn't bad. All right.
No, not bad.
That wasn't bad.
You have to practice the setup a little more for that.
Well, some of them are easy. If I can, if all I had to do was make fun of Ralph M. Rivera, then I'm set. Every one of these Barry clips can be somehow used to make fun of Ralph M. Rivera.
Yep.
All right. Well, Doug, seriously, thanks. And where can people go to find you, man?
Best thing is just go to dougkaye.com, DOUGKAYE.com. There you'll find 99% photography stuff. And if you dig through the blog, you might be able to find some old podcast stuff.
Right? That's awesome. Well, this has been great, and I think there's so much more we could talk about. So perhaps in the future we can delve into some different topics. But we really appreciate it, Doug. And thank you, everybody, for listening, because without you, this show means nothing, because we're here to help you. So check out podcastengineeringschool.com. Listen to all our previous sessions, and also check out the school. And Doug, you have to yell "sound great" with me at the end here, okay?
All right.
All right, ready? Sound
Ready.
great!
Sound great!
You walk away from me well, and you can't play that part so well. Why do you play it out on me now? You like to lose control well. It's quite a feeling, isn't it? They're floating, drifting down now. Tell me that you found something better. How should I respond to that? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. What do you want me to say? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. Do we get some empathy? Change your attitude where you say I just don't get it now. You say your eyes so far away now. You gave up on me well, so change your game and give a break. You say I wouldn't understand now. You tell me that you found something better. How should I respond to that? Oh yeah, I say now. It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. What do you want me to say? It's a lie. I don't wanna hear it. Do we get some empathy? I want you to know you will ever always be true. I've gone over all we've been through. Doesn't seem that long a time now. Things we did still hold their meaning. It doesn't mean it's still the same. You're pushing me away. The your theory